The first thing Samuel Carter noticed wasn't the silence. It was the absence of life. For 3 summers, the drought had slowly stolen the sounds he had known since childhood. The cheerful chatter of meadowlarks at sunrise had disappeared. The frogs that once sang from the creek every evening had gone quiet months ago. Even the wind seemed reluctant to cross the brittle fields surrounding Carter Ranch, as though it carried too much sorrow to keep moving. On that August morning, beneath a wide Texas sky that refused to offer a single cloud, Samuel stood beside the last cow he had hoped to save. The old Hereford struggled to breathe, its ribs pressed against loose hide, and its tired eyes searched Samuel's face as though asking a question neither of them could answer. Samuel knelt in the dust, resting one weathered hand gently against the animal's neck. "You fought hard," he whispered, "harder than most folks ever will." The cow let out one final, weary breath before becoming still. Samuel closed his eyes. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he removed his worn straw hat, looked toward the endless sky, and quietly spoke words he had never imagined leaving his lips. "I don't understand, Lord." There was no thunder, no whisper on the wind, only hate, the kind of relentless heat that seemed determined to erase every trace of hope from the land. A pickup truck rumbled down the gravel road in the distance, raising a trail of pale dust before disappearing again behind a stand of dying mesquite trees. Samuel barely noticed it. Trucks came and went every day now. Feed deliveries, bank inspectors, neighbors checking on one another. Sometimes strangers hoping to buy land from families who had finally run out of reasons to say no. He remained beside the cow until the sun climbed higher. When he finally stood, his knees protested, reminding him that 62 years left their mark on a man who had spent nearly every one of them working the same soil. He looked across what had once been one of the healthiest cattle ranches in Mason County. Now the ponds were empty. The fences cast longer shadows than the grass. The earth had cracked open in jagged patterns that looked almost like old scars. His grandfather used to say, "The land remembered every season." Samuel wondered if that meant it also remembered every heartbreak. The mailbox at the end of the driveway held a single envelope. He recognized the return address before he reached it. First State Agricultural Bank. He didn't need to open it. He unrolled, made comfortably. Still, he carefully unfolded the letter inside. Final notice. Unless payment arrangements were made within 14 days, foreclosure proceedings would begin. He folded the paper with the same care someone might use returning a flag after a funeral. Not because the words deserved respect, because panic never had. Samuel slipped the letter into his shirt pocket and climbed into his faded blue Ford pickup. The cracked leather seat welcomed him like an old friend. The truck started on the second try, just as it always had. Some things, at least, were still faithful. The road into town took nearly 20 minutes. Along the way, he passed ranches that looked painfully familiar. Rusted windmills, dry-stock tanks, for sale signs that hadn't been there a year ago. One property sat completely abandoned, its farmhouse windows covered with plywood. Samuel remembered teaching the owner's youngest boy how to fish in the creek behind the church. The creek itself no longer existed. Main Street in Mason looked busy enough from a distance, but everyone knew better. People smiled a little longer now. They asked a few more questions, not because life was good, because they were quietly checking who might need help next. Samuel parked beside Parker's Feed and Supply. The owner, Earl Parker, met him at the door before he even reached the porch. "You came for feed?" Earl asked gently. Samuel smiled. "You know I did." Earl hesitated. "I wish I had better news." Samuel already understood. The price went up again. Earl nodded. "Third increase this month." Neither man complained. There wasn't much point. They stood together for a moment, watching dust drift across Main Street. Finally, Earl sighed. "Victor Hayes was here yesterday." Samuel's expression barely changed. So I heard. He bought another ranch. Which one? The McMillan place. Samuel looked away. 3 generations. Gone. Just like that. Victor Hayes represented a large agricultural investment company based in Dallas, while smaller ranchers fought to survive. His company quietly purchased property across central Texas, often paying barely enough to settle outstanding loans. Some folks called him practical. Others called him a vulture. Samuel tried not to call him anything. Judgment was easier than understanding, and Samuel had spent enough years reading scripture to know the difference. Still, every ranch Victor bought felt like another page torn from the history of their community. Earl cleared his throat. He'll probably come see you. Samuel smiled faintly. Your rod and your staff. I told him Carter Ranch isn't for sale. Earl studied his friend's tired face. You sure? Samuel looked toward the hills beyond town. My grandfather's buried here. So is my father. And my wife. He paused. I'd have to leave more than land behind. Oh, didn't argue. Some things could never be explained to people who hadn't planted trees, knowing someone else would someday sit beneath them. By noon, the church fellowship hall was filling with volunteers preparing meals for several struggling families. Samuel carried boxes without being asked. Mrs. Jenkins greeted him with her usual smile. You skipped breakfast again. I had coffee. Caffeine isn't breakfast. I've survived 62 years. And you've had women looking after you for 61 of them. Samuel laughed. My wife would have agreed with you. Mrs. Jenkins softened. We all miss Mary. So do I. It had been 5 years since cancer took her. Some mornings Samuel still reached across the bed expecting to find her there. Grief didn't disappear. It simply learned better manners. Pastor Daniel Brooks entered carrying several bags of groceries. His silver hair had thinned considerably since becoming pastor nearly 30 years earlier, but his eyes remained steady, the kind of eyes that had listened to hundreds of burdens without ever pretending to have easy answers. He set the bags down and walked over. How's the ranch? Samuel smiled automatically. It's standing. Daniel looked at him for several quiet seconds. So are you? Samuel nodded once. For now. The pastor didn't press. Instead, he asked, Walk with me? They stepped outside into the afternoon heat. The church sat on a small rise overlooking Merchant Mason. From there, they could see the courthouse, the grain elevator, and beyond that, miles of thirsty countryside shimmering beneath the relentless sun. Daniel rested both hands on the wooden railing. When was the last time you rested? Samuel chuckled. I owned cattle. That wasn't an answer. I'll rest when it rains. Daniel smiled. I've heard worse plans. They stood together watching a pair of children chase each other across the church lawn. Life somehow continued. Even here. Even now. After several minutes, Daniel spoke again. Emily called. Samuel looked surprised. She called you. She worries. So do I. She thinks you should move to Dallas. Samuel sighed. She thinks I'd enjoy a retirement. Would you? Samuel answered without hesitation. I would know who I was. Daniel nodded slowly. There it is. What? The real answer. Samuel leaned against the railing. My grandfather cleared that land with mules. My father rebuilt after the wildfire in '68. Mary planted every oak tree around the house. He swallowed. If I leave, his voice faded. Daniel finished the sentence for him. It feels like leaving them. Samuel looked out. Neither man spoke for nearly a minute. Finally, Daniel placed a hand on his shoulder. Samuel, there is something about your father. Samuel looked up. Daniel's expression had changed, more thoughtful, more distant. A story? Samuel asked. Daniel nodded. One I've never told you. Why not? Because I never believed the right time had come. And now? The pastor looked toward the dry horizon, where the shimmering heat blurred earth and sky into a single endless line. I'm beginning to think. He stopped. Samuel waited. Daniel rarely interrupted himself. Instead, the older pastor slowly shook his head. No, what is it? Daniel forced a small smile. When the time comes, I'll tell you. Samuel frowned. Tell me what? But Daniel had already turned toward the church doors as someone inside called his name. Samuel watched him disappear into the fellowship hall, leaving behind a question that settled heavily in his mind. A story about his father. A story kept hidden for decades. A story that, for some reason, Pastor Daniel believed wasn't ready to be told. Samuel couldn't have known that before another week had passed. Everything he believed about his family's past, and perhaps even about the drought itself, would begin to change. Samuel drove home beneath a sky that seemed determined to remain empty forever. The afternoon sun hung low enough to cast long shadows across the ranch, but it offered no relief from the heat. As he passed through the front gate, he instinctively glanced toward the pond where, years ago, neighborhood children would gather every 4th of July to fish, while their parents shared barbecue beneath the oak trees Mary had planted. Now the pond was little more than a bowl of cracked clay. He parked beside the old farmhouse and sat quietly behind the steering wheel. The engine ticked as it cooled. The house looked exactly as it had the day Mary passed away. Her rocking chair still rested on the porch. Wind chimes she had bought during a church fundraiser barely moved in the still air. Every evening Samuel found himself looking toward the kitchen window, almost expecting to see her smiling as she wiped flour from her hands. Grief had softened over the years, but it had never completely left. It had simply become another member of the household. Inside, Samuel placed the foreclosure notice beneath a stack of unpaid invoices. There was no reason to leave it lying out where it could demand attention every time he walked through the room. He opened the refrigerator. A gallon of milk, eggs, leftover stew, nothing more. Mary had always laughed that farmers were experts at feeding the world while forgetting to feed themselves. Samuel warmed the stew and carried the bowl onto the porch. As evening settled over the ranch, he opened the small leather Bible that had belonged to his father. The edges of the pages had yellowed from decades of use. Several verses were underlined in faded blue ink. His father had never underlined many passages, only the ones he had needed. Samuel traced one of those lines with his thumb before quietly closing the Bible again. Tonight, he couldn't concentrate. His thoughts kept returning to Pastor Daniel's unfinished sentence. There is something about your father. What could possibly have remained hidden for all these years? The question lingered long after darkness settled across the ranch. The next morning began before sunrise. Habit had always awakened Samuel before the alarm. He stepped outside carrying 2 empty buckets, though there was little left to feed. The remaining cattle gathered slowly around him. Once there had been more than 200 head grazing these pastures. Now only 14 remained. He spoke to each animal as he worked. Mary used to tease him about that. You know they can't answer you. They don't have to, he'd tell her. Sometimes listening is enough. As he reached the final pen, he noticed fresh tire tracks leading toward the entrance gates. Someone had been there overnight. His stomach tightened. Cattle theft wasn't common, but desperate times often brought desperate choices. He climbed into the pickup and followed the tracks. They ended at the gate. Nothing had been taken. Instead, tucked beneath the chains securing the entrance was a plain white envelope, no stamp, no return address. Inside was a handwritten note. I'm sorry for what you're going through. Keep the gate unlocked tomorrow morning. Trust me. There was no signature. Samuel read the note twice, then a third time. It wasn't a prank. The handwriting carried the careful steadiness of someone older, someone deliberate. He folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket. By mid-morning, Emily called from Dallas. Dad, "Morning, sweetheart. You sound tired." "I've sounded tired for 20 years. You know what I mean?" Samuel smiled, despite himself. Emily had inherited Mary's ability to hear what people weren't saying. "I talked to the bank." He closed his eyes. "You'll rob, they comfortably. They're willing to work with you if you sell part of the property." "I'm thinking about it." It wasn't entirely true, but neither was it entirely false. Emily hesitated. "I don't want you to lose everything trying to save something that may already be gone." Samuel looked across the pasture. "When your grandfather bought this place, people said the same thing after the flood. Dad, Dad, and after the wildfire. This is different." "I know." His voice softened. "I really do." Emily's own voice began to crack. "I already lost Mom." "I can't lose you too." For several moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, Samuel said, "I'll be careful. I need more than that." "I know." After they ended the call, Samuel remained standing beneath the porch roof for a long time. Sometimes the hardest conversations weren't with strangers. They were with the people who loved you enough to fear for you. 2 days later, Victor Hayes arrived exactly as Earl Parker had predicted. His black SUV looked strangely out of place against the dusty ranch road. Victor stepped out wearing polished boots that had likely never touched a cattle pen. Yet there was nothing arrogant about the way he carried himself. Only confidence. "Mr. Carter." "Victor, I appreciate you seeing me." Samuel gestured toward the porch. "You've driven a long way. Might as well have some iced tea." Victor smiled. "I'd like that." They sat across from one another as cicadas buzzed from the dry trees. "I'll get straight to the point," Victor said. "My cup, honey, has increased its offer." Samuel remained quiet. "We're prepared to pay enough to clear every debt, and then you move closer to your daughter. You retire. You finally rest." Samuel looked toward the fields. "You've practiced that speech a few times." Victor leaned forward. "I know what people in town think about me. They think I enjoy buying ranches from struggling families. Truth is," he paused, "I grew up on one." That caught Samuel off guard. "My father lost ours when I was 16. Samuel studied him carefully. "You swore it'd never happen to you." Victor nodded. "So I built something nobody could take away." For the first time, Samuel saw not an investor, but a man shaped by old wounds. Different choices, same scars. "I respect what you've built," Samuel said quietly, "but Carter Ranch isn't just an asset." Victor sighed. "I was afraid you'd say that." He reached into his briefcase and placed another envelope on the table. "The offer stands until Friday." He stood, tipping his hat politely before walking back toward the SUV. Just before opening the door, he looked back. "I truly hope I'm wrong." "So do I." Victor drove away. Samuel never touched the envelope. Friday suddenly felt much closer than it should have. The following morning, just after sunrise, Samuel remembered the anonymous note. "Keep the gate unlocked tomorrow morning. Trust me." He almost laughed at himself. What was he expecting? A delivery? A neighbor? Nothing happened for nearly an hour. Then, sometime after 8, an old pickup appeared on the county road. It wasn't new. It wasn't impressive. Its faded paint had long surrendered to years of Texas sun. The truck slowed at the open gate before turning into the ranch. Samuel stepped onto the porch. The driver climbed out slowly. He appeared to be in his late 50s. His jeans were worn thin at the knees. His work boots carried the dust of many rolls. His face was deeply lined, but his eyes held an unexpected gentleness. In the truck bed rested a weathered wooden box, carefully secured with rope. The stranger removed his hat. "My name is Miguel Alvarez." Samuel waited. "I heard you might need another pair of hands." Samuel looked around the ranch. "I'm afraid you've come to the wrong place." Miguel smiled softly. I don't think I have. I can't pay wages. I didn't ask for any. I can barely feed myself. I eat very little. Samuel frowned. Why would anyone volunteer to work on a ranch that's about to disappear? Miguel glanced across the cracked fields as though he were seeing something no one else could. Then he answered with quiet certainty. Because I believe this land still has a story left to tell. Samuel had no explanation for the strange peace that settled over him in that moment. He didn't know who this man was. He didn't know who had sent him. And he certainly didn't know why a complete stranger would arrive carrying nothing but a small duffel bag and an old wooden box he never let out of his sight. Samuel wasn't sure what unsettled him more, the stranger's confidence or the calmness with which he carried it. Most men who arrived at Carter Ranch these days wanted something: a signature, a bargain, a chance to buy equipment before the bank hauled it away. Miguel Alvarez asked for none of those things. He simply picked up his worn duffel bag, carefully lifted the weathered wooden box from the bed of his pickup, and waited. You really mean to stay? Samuel finally asked. If you'll have me. For how long? Miguel smiled, the kind of smile earned through years of surviving disappointment. As long as I'm needed. Samuel looked toward the empty bunkhouse near the equipment shed. It isn't much. I've slept in worse. By sunset, Miguel had swept the dusty floor, repaired a broken window, and somehow managed to make the old place look lived in again. Samuel noticed something else. The man never hurried. Every movement seemed deliberate, measured, as though rushing only caused people to miss what mattered. The next morning, before the sun had fully cleared the eastern hills, Samuel found Miguel standing near the dry creek bed. He wasn't working. He wasn't praying. He was simply looking. His eyes followed the shape of the land from one ridge to another. What are you seeing? Samuel asked. Miguel crouched and picked up a handful of dusty soil. The land remembers. Samuel blinked. My grandfather used to say that. Miguel let the dirt slip through his fingers. He was right. Samuel gave a polite smile. There's not much left for it to remember. Miguel didn't answer. Instead, he walked several yards uphill. Stopped. Ben turned in a slow circle before pressing the heel of his boot into the ground. Has anyone ever dug here? Samuel laughed softly. Friend, we've dug everywhere. Wells. 3. Any maps? Samuel frowned. My father kept old survey records. I'd like to see them. Samuel couldn't imagine why. Still, there was something about Miguel that made refusing feel almost unreasonable. That afternoon, they climbed into the farmhouse attic. Boxes lined the walls beneath decades of dust. Mary's Christmas decorations, Emily's school projects, old branding irons, a seated chest filled with family photographs. Finally, Samuel found a leather tube tied with faded twine. He spread several yellowed maps across the dining room table. Miguel studied them in complete silence. Minutes passed, then more. Samuel poured 2 cups of coffee. Neither man spoke. Finally, Miguel tapped one corner of the oldest survey. This drawing. It doesn't match the newer ones. Samuel leaned closer. I've never noticed. Look. Miguel traced a faint blue pencil line that curved across the property. It disappears here. My grandfather always said there used to be another creek. Miguel nodded. I think it was more than a creek. Samuel stared at the faded line. What are you saying? I'm saying someone changed these surveys. Samuel felt a chill despite the heat. Why would anyone do that? I don't know, but I think your father did. Samuel looked up sharply. My father? Miguel met his eyes. Not to hide something, to protect it. The room fell silent. Pastor Daniel's unfinished words echoed through Samuel's memory. There is something about your father. For the first time, Samuel wondered whether the old pastor and this quiet stranger somehow shared pieces of the same forgotten story. The following days settled into an unexpected rhythm. They repaired fences that no cattle remained to challenge. They serviced equipment Samuel had assumed would never run again. Each evening, Miguel asked strange questions. Where did the water stand after heavy rains? Which oak loses its leaves last? Where does the frost disappear first? Samuel answered as best he could. Only gradually did he realize Miguel wasn't making conversation. He was assembling a picture. Late one evening, Emily arrived unexpectedly from Dallas. She climbed out of her SUV and wrapped her father in a long embrace. "You look thinner. You sound like Mrs. Jenkins." "I'll take that as a compliment." Then she noticed Miguel carrying firewood toward the porch. "Dad, who's that?" Samuel introduced them. Miguel tipped his hat politely. Emily smiled, though Samuel could see questions swarming behind her eyes. After supper, while Miguel washed dishes despite Samuel's protests, Emily lowered her voice. "You don't know anything about him." "I know enough." "You've known him less than a week." "I've known people for years who turned out to be strangers." She sighed. "And sometimes strangers become family?" Samuel smiled. "Sometimes." Emily looked toward the kitchen. "There's something different about him." "What do you mean?" "I can't explain it. He doesn't act like someone looking for work." Samuel nodded slowly. "I've noticed." The next morning, Miguel asked Samuel to bring a shovel. "Only one." "That's all." "One is enough." They walked nearly half a mile beyond the southern pasture until Miguel stopped beside a cluster of weathered cedar trees. "This is the place." Samuel looked around. "There isn't anything here." Miguel handed him the shovel. "Dig." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "You've been comfortably overflows." Miguel chuckled. "Maybe." Still, Samuel drove the shovel into the hard ground. The first foot revealed nothing but dry clay. The second was much the same. By the third, sweat soaked through both men's shirts. Samuel leaned on the shovel. "I appreciate optimism, but we're digging a hole in Texas during the worst drought in decades." Miguel knelt beside the opening. He pressed his palm against the exposed earth. Then he smiled. "It's cooler." Samuel touched the soil. Miguel was right, only slightly, but unmistakably. "Keep digging." By late afternoon, the hole had reached nearly 6 feet. Samuel was ready to quit. Miguel wasn't. Then the sound came. Not water. Not yet. A hollow echo. Samuel stopped. What was that? Miguel climbed carefully into the pit and brushed away more dirt with his hands. Something smooth emerged beneath the clay. Wood. Old wood. They cleared another section. It wasn't a tree root. It was a timber, carefully shaped, weathered, part of something larger. Samuel stared in disbelief. "What is it?" Miguel whispered, almost to himself. "I was hoping I wasn't too late." Just then, the timber shifted. A narrow gap opened beneath it. From somewhere deep below came the faintest sound imaginable. A slow, steady drip, drip, drip. Samuel held his breath. For 3 years, he had dreamed of hearing water. Now, standing beside a stranger who seemed to know his land better than he did himself. He wasn't sure whether he was witnessing a miracle or uncovering a secret someone had buried generations earlier. If you've ever lived through a season when hope seemed impossible, Samuel would later tell friends, don't stop digging too soon. Sometimes the answer is only one more shovel's depth away. But neither he nor Miguel yet understood that the hidden structure beneath their feet was only the beginning. Because before the next sunrise, Pastor Daniel would arrive carrying an old photograph and a truth about Samuel's father that had remained hidden for over 40 years. The first light of dawn had barely touched the cedar trees when Samuel heard another truck climbing the gravel road. Pastor Daniel stepped out slowly, holding a weathered manila envelope against his chest as though it contained something fragile. He looked first at the deep hole on the ground, then at Miguel. Finally, his eyes settled on Samuel. "So," the pastor said quietly, "you found it." Samuel stared. "You knew?" Daniel let out a long breath. "I prayed you never would have to." Miguel removed his hat, but said nothing. For a moment, the three men simply stood in silence while the breeze carried the scent of dry earth across the hillside. Samuel finally broke it. "Someone needs to explain what's happening." Daniel nodded. "You deserve that." They returned to the farmhouse, where Daniel carefully opened the old envelope on the kitchen table. Inside were several faded photographs, a folded survey map, and a handwritten letter whose edges had become soft with age. Samuel immediately recognized one face, his father, Thomas Carter. He looked 20 years younger, standing beside several men he didn't recognize. One of them was unmistakably Miguel, or at least someone who looked remarkably like him. Samuel frowned. That can't be." Miguel smiled gently. "It isn't me." He pointed to the photograph. "My father." Samuel looked again. The resemblance was undeniable. "They worked together?" he asked. Daniel nodded. "More than 40 years ago." The room grew still as Daniel began telling a story Samuel had never heard. Back then, Mason County had suffered another terrible drought. It hadn't lasted as long as this one, but it was severe enough that many ranchers considered abandoning their land. One evening, a church mission group arrived carrying supplies for migrant families working nearby. Among them was a young man named Rafael Alvarez, Miguel's father. He wasn't an engineer then, Daniel explained. He simply knew water. Rafael had grown up in the mountains, where generations of his family had learned to read landscapes the way other men read books. During his time helping local ranchers, he discovered an old underground spring flowing beneath several properties, including Carter Ranch. It wasn't large, Daniel said, but it never completely dried. Samuel looked toward the window. "If Father knew about it, he chose to hide it," Daniel answered. "Why?" "Why?" Daniel unfolded the second map. "Because a private development company wanted to buy this entire valley." Samuel's eyes widened. "They knew about the water. They suspected. If they'd found proof, every ranch here would have been forced into years of legal battles." Miguel quietly added, "Some families would have lost everything. So my father buried it. He protected it." Samuel struggled to absorb what he was hearing. His entire life he had believed Carter Ranch survived because of hard work, good neighbors, and God's provision. Now he realized there had been another layer to the story. His father had protected something precious not only for his own family, but for everyone living in the valley. Daniel carefully unfolded the handwritten letter. "He asked me to keep this." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because he made me promise." Samuel looked hurt. "For 40 years. Daniel's voice softened. "He believed the secret should stay buried unless there came a day when this community truly needed it again." The pastor handed him the letter. Thomas Carter's handwriting was unmistakable. "If you're reading this, then the valley has probably reached another difficult season. Remember this. Water is a gift, never a weapon. If the spring is ever uncovered again, make sure it serves neighbors before profit. There will always be someone offering money. Choose people instead." Samuel blinked several times before lowering the page. For the first time since Mary had died, tears slipped freely down his face. "My father trusted me with something he never even told me." Daniel gently corrected him. "He trusted the man you would become." That afternoon, Samuel and Miguel returned to the excavation. Together they carefully removed more soil around the buried timbers. What they uncovered wasn't merely an old support beam. It was part of a forgotten stone collection chamber built generations earlier to protect the natural spring beneath the ranch. The craftsmanship amazed Samuel. Someone had planned for droughts long before modern equipment ever existed. Miguel smiled as cool moisture appeared between the stones. The spring never disappeared. It was simply waiting. Word spread quickly through Mason. By evening, several neighbors had arrived carrying tools, lanterns, and homemade meals. Nobody asked who was paying. Nobody discussed ownership. They simply worked. Earl Parker repaired broken supports. Mrs. Jenkins brought lemonade. Teenagers hauled buckets of dirt without complaint. Emily watched in disbelief. I haven't seen the whole town together like this since Mom's funeral. Samuel looked around at the familiar faces. Neither have I. Even Victor Hayes arrived before sunset. He stood beside his SUV watching volunteers fill the hillside. Samuel walked over. I wasn't expecting you. Victor smiled awkwardly. I came to withdraw my offer. Samuel looked surprised. Victor nodded toward the families working together. I finally understand what I was trying to buy, and it isn't the land. It's this. He gestured toward the people. My company can purchase acreage, but it can't manufacture a community. For the first time, the two men shook hands, not as opponents, but as neighbors. As darkness settled, Miguel quietly carried the weathered wooden box from his truck. Samuel noticed how carefully he handled it. You've pre-tabled the for me. Back up overflow. Miguel nodded. It belonged to my father. What's inside? Miguel rested the box on a porch railing. My father told me never to open it until I found Thomas Carter's son. Samuel felt his heart begin to race. Miguel slowly lifted the brass latch. The old hinges creaked. Inside lay a small wooden cross, worn smooth by time. Beneath it rested a leather-bound journal, and underneath the journal, another sealed envelope. This one carried Samuel's name. Not written recently, written decades ago. Samuel Carter, in his father's unmistakable handwriting. He looked at Daniel. The pastor slowly smiled through moist eyes. I never knew there was another letter. Samuel reached for the envelope with trembling hands. Whatever his father had waited 40 years to tell him was finally about to be revealed. Samuel held the envelope for several long moments before breaking the brittle seal. No one spoke. The evening air was still, and the only sound came from the distant creak of the old windmill that had not pumped water in years. Inside the envelope rested a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was unmistakably his father's. Son, my and the sword, if this letter has found its way into your hands, then life has probably become much harder than I ever hoped it would. I wanted to tell you this myself many times, but every time I looked at you, I saw a young man who still needed to build his own faith before carrying someone else's story. There will come a day when you believe you've lost everything. When that day comes, remember this. God's provision is rarely early. It is never late, and it almost never arrives the way we imagine. If the spring is uncovered again, don't think of it as your miracle. Think of it as your responsibility. Share it, protect it. Never let fear make you selfish. The land has never belonged to us. We've only been trusted to care for it. Love, Dad. Samuel lowered the letter, unable to speak. For years he had carried the weight of believing that every burden rested on his shoulders alone. Now he realized his father had been preparing him for this very season long, before either of them could have imagined it. Miguel quietly closed the wooden box. My father carried that across 2 countries, he said softly. He believed someday I'd find the Carter family again. Samuel looked at him. He remembered one act of kindness for 40 years. Miguel smiled. When people have very little, they remember those who treated them with dignity. Pastor Daniel rested a hand on Samuel's shoulder. Neither of your fathers lived to see this day. No. But somehow, Samuel looked toward the gathering outside, where neighbors continued working beneath portable lights. They're both still part of it. The following morning, The excavation continued. With help from nearly half the town, the old stone chamber was carefully restored rather than torn apart. Water began flowing more freely, filling a small collection basin before continuing toward the dry creek bed. It wasn't enough to end the drought. It wasn't a river. It wasn't even enough to irrigate every ranch in the valley, but it was enough to keep livestock alive, enough to provide drinking water, enough to give people time. Sometimes hope didn't arrive as abundance. Sometimes it arrived as enough. Word spread beyond Mason County. Reporters came. Agricultural experts visited. Some called it an engineering discovery. Others called it remarkable luck. Samuel never argued with either explanation. He simply smiled whenever someone asked what he believed. I think blessings often look ordinary until we remember where they came from. A week later, Victor Hayes returned one final time. This time, he carried no contracts. Instead, he walked into Samuel's barn wearing work gloves. "I've been thinking." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "That sounds dangerous." Victor laughed. "It probably is." He looked around the barn before continuing. "My company owns several drilling rigs that aren't being used right now." Samuel listened quietly. "I'd like to loan them to the county." "Loan?" "No charge." Samuel studied him. "Why?" Victor looked across the valley where volunteers continued repairing old water lines. "My father used to say success means very little if nobody else can stand beside you when you reach it." He smiled faintly. "I spent a lot of years forgetting that." Within days, additional wells were repaired across neighboring properties. The spring beneath Carter Ranch was never treated as private property. Instead, but local ranchers formed a cooperative to maintain and protect it together, just as Thomas Carter had hoped, just as Rafael Alvarez had envisioned. Late one Sunday afternoon, after church services had ended, the congregation gathered beneath the oak trees Mary had planted decades earlier. Children laughed as they chased one another through the grass. Someone played old gospel hymns on an acoustic guitar. Mrs. Jenkins insisted everyone eat another slice of pie. For the first time in many months, laughter carried farther than worry. Emily stood beside her father, watching the familiar scene. "I owe you an apology." Samuel smiled. "For what?" "I thought you were holding on to the rash because you couldn't let go. And now, I think you stayed because you knew something worth loving is worth fighting for." Samuel slipped an arm around her shoulders. "I wasn't always sure." "You looked sure." "I was terrified." Emily looked at him in surprise. "You never showed it." Samuel chuckled softly. "Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's deciding fear doesn't get the final word." A few days later, clouds began gathering over the western hills. Nobody wanted to mention them. The town had learned not to celebrate too early. By evening, the sky had grown dark. The wind shifted. Samuel walked onto the porch, feeling something he hadn't experienced in months. Cool air. Miguel stepped beside him. "It smells different." Samuel nodded. "It does." The first raindrop landed on the porch railing. Then another. Then a dozen more. Within moments, rain covered the valley. Not a violent storm. Not a flood. A slow, steady rain that soaked into the thirsty earth. Samuel closed his eyes as water ran down his face. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't shout. He simply stood there, letting the rain wash away months of exhaustion. Across the yard, neighbors laughed like children. Some cried openly. Others simply looked toward the sky in quiet gratitude. Pastor Daniel walked onto the porch. "You asked God a question that morning." Samuel smiled. "I remember." "I don't understand, Lord." Samuel nodded. "I did. And now?" And now, Samuel watched rain ripple across the pond that had been dry for 3 years. "I don't have every answer." Daniel smiled. "You never were promised them." "No, Samuel looked across the ranch where Miguel stood beneath the rain with a peaceful smile. But I learned something. What's that? God didn't forget me during the drought. He was already sending the people I'd need before I ever knew I needed them. Months passed. Grass returned to the hills. Calves were born again. The creek flowed once more. Not every family recovered immediately. Some ranches had already been sold. Some losses could never be undone, but the town itself had changed. People visited one another more often. Church attendance wasn't larger because of fear. It was stronger because gratitude had become more visible. Miguel eventually prepared to leave. Samuel found him loading his truck one quiet morning. You don't have to go. Miguel smiled warmly. My father always told me we're sometimes called to plant trees whose shade we'll never enjoy. He extended his hand. My work here is finished. Samuel pulled him into a hug instead. You'll always have a home here. I know. Miguel climbed into his truck. Before driving away, he looked back one final time. Take good care of the spring. Samuel nodded. We all will. Years later, visitors would occasionally ask about the small wooden box displayed inside the Carter farmhouse. Samuel would tell them it wasn't valuable because of the wood, or the letters, or even the cross resting inside. It was valuable because it reminded him that the greatest answers to prayer often arrive wearing work boots, carrying old scars, and asking for nothing in return. When people asked how Carter Ranch survived the Great Drought, Samuel always gave the same answer. It wasn't one miracle. It was thousands of small acts of faithfulness woven together by a God who was working long before any of us could see it. And every evening, as the sun settled behind the Texas hills, he would sit on Mary's old porch beside the sound of flowing water, grateful not because life had become perfect, but because he had finally learned that hope is strongest when it is shared. The words carved into a small wooden plaque beside the restored spring became the quiet motto of the valley. God's answers don't always fall from the sky. Sometimes they walk quietly down a dusty road, carried by ordinary people willing to love their neighbors.